Boudicca knelt on the cold ground of the Roman encampment, her breath shallow and broken. The ropes that had held her were still swaying in the air, stained with traces of her blood. Behind her, her two daughters clung to each other, their small bodies trembling in the fading light of Britannia. The wind moved through the wooden posts like a warning whispered by the land itself, a low and steady murmur that carried the weight of everything that had just been taken from them. The Roman soldiers watched her with a smug quietness, their armor catching the last rays of daylight. To them, this was not an outrage. It was entertainment, a display of what they believed to be the natural order of the world. They saw no queen before them, only a defeated native woman who had dared to exist outside the rules Rome imposed. Their eyes were filled with the certainty of an empire that had crushed countless nations and never imagined that one wounded woman could fracture its sense of invincibility. Boudicca lifted her head slowly. Her hair hung in tangled strands, her skin bruised and marked, but her gaze held something the Romans were too arrogant to understand. It was not a gaze of surrender. It was the still and heavy calm that settles in the air before a storm. Her daughters stood close, drawing strength from the silence around her, a silence that felt like the ground itself was holding its breath. A young Roman soldier stepped back without knowing why. The world had shifted in a way he could not explain. He felt it before he understood it. Something inside the woman before him had not been beaten. Something had been awakened. As the sky darkened over the encampment, the earth of Britannia seemed to rise to meet her. And in that moment, anyone who truly looked into her eyes would have realized a simple truth. Rome had made a mistake that could not be undone. Stay with this story and follow the rise that begins here. Like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next chapter of this dark history. Boudicca rose from the ground of the Roman camp, carrying wounds that would outlive her bruises. But the turning point in her story did not begin with the ropes and the blood. It began earlier, when Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, breathed his last breath. He had ruled a people who still placed their faith in oaths spoken around fires and in the strength of their own hands. Yet he knew that Rome did not understand such loyalty. He knew that an empire could crush a tribe with the same ease that a boot shattered a twig. So he had tried to bind peace with a document that divided his wealth between his daughters and the empire. He believed that sharing power would protect his people once he was gone. Prasutagus had spent his life walking the line between defiance and surrender. He bowed when Rome demanded tribute, and lifted his head only when he was alone among his own people. The Iceni accepted this balance because it gave them space to live in their own traditions. In the lands of the Celt, women could inherit. Lineage could pass through daughters. Women could rule. They could ride beside men in battle and stand in council with equal voice. The Iceni were not Rome. Their world did not revolve around the authority of men or the rigid laws of a senate far across the sea. Rome viewed this as foolishness. To Roman lawmakers, the idea that a kingdom could be handed to two young women was an insult to the order they believed they upheld. When Prasutagus died, they saw only a gap in power that needed to be filled. They arrived not as guardians of a peaceful transition, but as claimants to land they believed should never have belonged to the Iceni in the first place. The day the Romans entered Iceni territory, they did not hide behind gentle words. They arrived with ledgers and soldiers, pretending to enforce legal rights while performing something far more deliberate. They walked into homes and took what they desired. They pried rings from fingers and tore blankets from children. They opened storage pits and claimed every grain as property of the empire. What began as an inspection unfolded as a ceremony of domination. Each object stolen was a reminder that the Iceni no longer possessed anything that could not be taken. The warriors of the tribe watched with clenched fists, unable to raise a weapon without giving Rome an excuse to declare them rebels. Every stolen heirloom was a silent strike to the heart. Even the elders stood powerless, their voices dismissed as noise unworthy of translation. The land that had once moved under their command felt suddenly foreign, as if the very soil had been confiscated by decree. The humiliation of the tribe found its breaking point when Boudicca confronted the soldiers. She demanded to know why the wishes of her husband had been ignored. The Romans did not answer her. They dragged her forward in front of her people and struck her down. The whip cracked through the air and across her skin. Each blow carried meaning far beyond its physical sting. In the eyes of Rome, the whip was not simply a tool. It was a marker of caste. Only slaves and criminals received such punishment. The Romans were not punishing a crime. They were rewriting her status. They were stripping away the dignity of a queen and turning her into something they believed could be trampled without consequence. But the cruelty did not stop at her body. In full view of the tribe, Roman soldiers seized her daughters. Their screams echoed across the settlement as the men violated them. This was not drunken violence nor the chaos of untrained soldiers. It was a calculated gesture, a message crafted to shatter not only the women, but the foundation of the tribe itself. By touching the royal bloodline, Rome sought to crush the spirit of the ruler and the future she carried. Tacitus wrote that this act was permitted in plain sight, a display of power designed to silence loyalty and break the will of a people. In the logic of empires, nothing spoke louder than the destruction of the most sacred bonds. To strike a queen was to humiliate her. To defile her daughters was to show that there existed no boundary Rome would not cross to secure control. When the violence ended, the Iceni did not shout or weep. They stood in a silence so deep that even the wind seemed to draw back. It was a silence that made the soldiers uneasy because it held no surrender. It was the silence of a people who had witnessed their last threshold being crossed. They understood that Rome had gone too far. They understood that the old balance between tribute and survival had been shattered beyond repair. This silence would be the seed. It would grow in the dark soil of humiliation until it rose in a fury that Rome had not expected. It would bind tribes that had once been enemies. It would gather strength in forests and fields, and it would rise beneath the wheels of a war chariot led by a woman who had been forced to her knees but had never bowed. The silence that settled over the Iceni after the assault did not stay contained within their borders. It traveled like a cold wind across the hills and marshes of Britannia until it reached the ears of neighboring tribes. One message carried through every whisper. Rome had crossed a line that no people of the island could ignore. What had been done to Boudicca and her daughters was not a private wound. It was an attack on the very spirit of the land. The insult struck every tribe as if the lash and the violence had been inflicted upon their own kin. The leaders of distant clans began to arrive in the sacred forests, where the ancient oaks grew taller than any Roman tower. These groves had witnessed centuries of peace and war. Now they became the heart of a gathering unlike anything seen before. Warriors who once clashed over hunting grounds sat shoulder to shoulder near the same fire. Elders who had sworn never to speak to each other again now leaned forward with the same grim resolve. The story of Boudicca was told again and again. With each retelling, the anger grew heavier until it felt like the forest itself held its breath. The rites of the Celt took shape around them. Bundles of herbs burned in clay bowls, releasing a sharp scent that clung to the air like a promise. Warriors pressed their palms into the earth and lifted their hands coated with soil to swear loyalty to the coming fight. They spoke of ancestors who had defended the island before Rome was even a rumor across the sea. They spoke of daughters who deserved to grow up without chains waiting for them. Every vow made by the fire marked another step toward the rising storm. In the heart of this gathering stood Boudicca. The bruises on her skin had not yet faded, but they no longer dimmed her presence. They marked her like sacred symbols, reminders of a suffering that demanded an answer. She climbed onto her chariot, the wooden wheels still stained from the days she used it to travel through her shattered lands. Her hair caught the firelight and lifted in the wind, glowing like a banner of defiance. She did not need to shout to command silence. The tribes watched her with a reverence normally reserved for spirits or warriors of legend. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm weight of someone who had already crossed the threshold between grief and purpose. She did not call for rage. She called for unity. She reminded them that Rome relied on their divisions, that the strength of the island had always been in the way its people stood with the land beneath their feet. Each word threaded the tribes together until they felt less like separate clans and more like the limbs of a single body rising from long dormancy. The warriors responded in a wave of movement, spears lifted, shields pressed against the ground. They bowed their heads not in submission, but in recognition. Before them was not only a queen, she had become the living shape of the storm that Rome had created. The surrounding trees seemed to sway in agreement, their branches rustling like ancient voices calling for the reckoning that had been denied for too long. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, the tribes prepared to follow her. Their anger was no longer a scattered flame but a gathering blaze. The island was waking, and in the shadows between the trees, the first outlines of an army began to form, ready to move toward a future written in embers and steel. In the early months of the year 60 AD, when winter had only just begun to loosen its grip on Britannia, Camulodunum stood wrapped in the confidence of an empire that believed it had already conquered the island in both body and spirit. The mornings were cool and pale, the kind of mornings where smoke rose calmly from Roman villas and the citizens walked the streets as if nothing in the world could disturb their order. To them, Rome was eternal and unshakable. No whisper of defiance could possibly challenge it. Yet a storm was already forming beyond the eastern forests. Boudicca and the allied tribes moved under that pale dawn light with a purpose sharper than any spear. Mist gathered around their march until they appeared like figures pulled from the breath of the earth itself. Warriors followed her without hesitation. Mothers, hunters, elders, young men who had known nothing but Roman rule. Together they advanced toward the first stronghold that Rome had raised as proof of its dominion. Camulodunum, with its temples and statues, had always been a symbol of what the empire believed Britannia would become. Inside the city, early warnings were met with disregard. Rumors of burning villages drifted through taverns and markets, but Roman soldiers shrugged them off. A rebellion led by a woman seemed unthinkable. A native army capable of breaking the authority of Rome appeared even more absurd. Pride had become a cloak that blinded them to the truth. The people of Camulodunum went on with their daily business, unaware that the land beyond their walls was shifting under their feet. Then the storm arrived. The tribes surged from the tree line with a force that shattered the morning calm. Their voices rose in a single cry that echoed across the fields. Boudicca rode at the front, her chariot breaking through the soft ground like a blade drawn from its sheath. The sound of drums pulsed through the air. It was in that moment that the city understood the truth. The rebellion was not distant. It was at their gates. The defenses fell faster than anyone inside believed possible. With most Roman forces far away under the command of Suetonius, the city had only scattered soldiers and a confident facade. The gates splintered. Shields cracked under the weight of warriors who carried not only weapons but the memory of every wound Rome had carved into their lives. Panic spilled across the streets. Roman citizens fled in every direction, their voices merging with the roar of collapsing rooftops. Flames swept from house to house. Roof beams groaned and broke. Smoke thickened the sky until the sun itself dimmed. The streets that once embodied Roman order twisted into paths of chaos. The shrines built to honor Roman gods could not shield anyone. Statues crumbled under falling debris. Banners tore away in the wind. The empire that had believed itself invincible was watching its own reflection burn. Boudicca moved through the city with a stillness that contrasted the storm around her. Her chariot rolled through pools of ash and embers. She gave no command for mercy. The fire in her eyes was steady. Her fury was not reckless. It was the shaped and concentrated force of everything Rome had stolen. She had not come for negotiation. She had come to let the city feel what her people had felt. By the time the flames began to quiet, Camulodunum was gone. Not conquered, erased. Smoke climbed into the sky like a dark offering rising from the island itself. Nothing remained standing that could speak of Roman certainty. The city that once symbolized domination had become the first of many warnings. Boudicca did not slow her chariot as she left the ruins behind. Other Roman cities waited ahead, and the anger of Britannia was only beginning to reveal its strength. The smoke of Camulodunum still drifted across the sky when Boudicca turned her chariot south. The warriors who followed her carried the heat of that first victory in their breath. Word spread across the countryside faster than any messenger. Every mile brought more allies to her ranks. Every village that heard the news stepped out of the shadow Rome had cast over them. Ahead of them lay Londinium, the wealthiest settlement in Britannia and the beating heart of Roman trade on the island. To the tribes, it was the place where taxes flowed outward and troops flowed inward, a city that had grown rich while the people of Britannia bent under the weight of imperial rule. As they approached, the roads widened and the air grew thick with the sound of footsteps. Merchants hurried to gather their goods. Families packed whatever they could carry. The fear had already arrived before the warriors did. They knew the pattern. The fall of Camulodunum had broken the illusion that Rome could protect its subjects. Now the truth moved toward them with the force of a rising tide. Suetonius, the governor of Britannia, returned from the west to find panic spreading through Londinium. He rode through the streets with a hardened expression, listening to the pleas of citizens who believed Rome would defend them. But Suetonius saw the truth without turning away. His troops were few and exhausted. The tribes behind Boudicca numbered in tens of thousands. He understood that to stay would be to lose not only his men, but the entire command of the province. After a long moment of silence, he withdrew the last Roman soldiers. No promise, no comfort. He simply rode away, leaving the people behind to face what was coming. When the first lines of warriors appeared on the horizon, Londinium felt the breath of its own fate settling upon it. Windows slammed shut, doors barred. In the distance, the rumble of chariot wheels echoed through the open fields. Boudicca arrived at the head of her forces, the firelight of torches reflecting in her hair as the sun lowered behind her. The city had been built with the confidence of imperial triumph. Yet now its walls looked small against the swelling sea of warriors gathering at its gates. The attack began like a storm breaking open. Flames poured through the wooden structures faster than anyone inside could run. The narrow streets that once bustled with trade twisted into rivers of smoke. Grain stores burst in sparks. Market stalls collapsed as heat consumed their beams. Voices rose in terror and drowned beneath the roar of burning roofs. Londinium had always believed Rome could shelter it. Now it found itself exposed to the very anger that empire had planted through years of cruelty and indifference. Boudicca rode through the city with a stillness that contrasted the chaos around her. The wheels of her chariot rattled over stone that glowed red with embers. She watched the destruction with the same quiet resolve she had carried since the day the Romans had violated her family. She did not take pleasure in the flames. She allowed them to speak for her. The city had been a symbol of Roman wealth and Roman certainty. Now it was a reminder that nothing built on the suffering of a people could stand forever. The warriors tore down the last Roman standards. Temples cracked under the heat. Statues crumbled. The wealth that had once made Londinium proud scattered as ashes across the ground. When the fires finally began to soften, there was no city left to recover. Only charred beams and a silence heavy enough to shake the province. The fall of Londinium was more than a victory. It was a warning carried on the wind. Rome was not invincible. Rome could bleed. Rome could burn. Boudicca did not linger among the ruins. She turned her chariot toward the next road, the army moving behind her in a slow and steady current. Britannia had begun to reclaim itself, and each conquered settlement was another step toward a reckoning that had been promised long before the first flame touched the walls of Londinium. The ashes of Londinium still drifted behind the army when Boudicca turned her attention north. The tribes followed her with the confidence of those who had already broken 2 Roman cities. But farther along the great road that cut through Britannia, Suetonius was gathering the last strength Rome possessed. He chose his ground with the precision of a man who understood that his survival depended on more than his courage. Watling Street offered a narrow stretch of land with forest on both sides and high slopes behind him. It was a place where numbers meant little and formation meant everything. Suetonius arranged his men in a tight wedge, shields locked together so closely that they appeared like a single body of iron. Behind them waited the reserves, archers in calm rows, cavalry standing ready to strike. Every Roman soldier knew that this would decide the fate of the province. Boudicca arrived with a force so vast it seemed to swallow the landscape. Families who had followed the army in wagons lined the distant ridge to witness what they believed would be the final blow that drove Rome out of their homeland. The warriors poured onto the plain in waves. Their spirits were high. Their voices filled the air with the pride of people who had already burned the richest settlements of the empire. They believed sheer strength and fury would break the Roman line. Their confidence pulsed through the field like a second heartbeat. But when the first charge began, the difference between the 2 forces revealed itself with painful clarity. The tribes roared forward with tremendous power, yet they came in uneven clusters, spears lifted at different times, shields raised at awkward angles. Their courage was immense, but their unity wavered. The Romans did not move until the moment was right. Then the front line advanced in perfect rhythm. Shields held firm. Short swords thrust with cold precision. The wedge cut straight through the first rush of Celt warriors as if parting water. The sound of the clash filled the air with a mixture of screams and metal striking against bone. The Celts pushed forward again and again, but each time their line bent and scattered under the discipline of the Roman formation. Suetonius gave quiet commands, and the legion responded instantly. Step, brace, strike. The ground turned dark beneath their feet. The tribes fought with every ounce of strength they possessed. Yet their rage could not overcome the relentless order of an army trained to move as a single mind. As the battle grew fiercer, panic began to ripple through the outer ranks of the Celt forces. Warriors tripped over bodies, horses reared, the wagons behind them blocked any retreat. The open field that had seemed to promise victory entrapped them in a tightening circle. Roman javelins struck from behind the line of shields, arrows rained from above. Every moment pushed the tribes deeper into chaos. Boudicca drove her chariot along the flanks, urging her people to stand their ground. Her voice carried through the wind with the same resolve she had shown in every battle before this one. She reminded them of the wounds they carried and the justice they fought for. But even her presence could not restore order to the sea of warriors breaking apart before her eyes. The Roman line advanced with steady force until the noise of battle shifted from fury to desperation. By the time the sun lowered, the field had become a maze of fallen bodies and scattered weapons. The tribes who had marched with confidence now struggled to escape the crush of their own numbers. The wagons that once carried their families now formed a barrier that trapped them. The Romans pressed forward without pause, cutting through the last pockets of resistance. Dust and smoke blurred the horizon. Screams dissolved into distant echoes. When the final light of day touched the battlefield, Boudicca was nowhere to be seen. Some claimed she rode into the woods to escape the ruin. Others whispered that she chose death rather than fall into Roman hands. A few believed the earth itself opened to take her, refusing to let a queen of Britannia die under foreign rule. Her chariot was not found. Her body was never recovered. Only the silence that followed her disappearance remained, deep and heavy, leaving behind the first threads of a legend that would outlive every empire that ever ruled the island. In the days that followed the battle, a heavy stillness spread across Britannia. The fields that had echoed with the cries of thousands now lay quiet beneath drifting clouds. Suetonius moved quickly to restore Roman control. Roads were cleared, garrisons rebuilt, survivors were gathered and questioned. The empire worked with relentless purpose to erase the memory of its near defeat. Londinium rose again in stone and timber. Camulodunum was marked for reconstruction. The wounds of the province were covered as if plaster could heal what had been broken in the spirit of the land. Yet beneath every new wall and every fresh column, the soil held the memory of fire. Rome attempted to craft stories that softened the humiliation it had suffered. Officials proclaimed that order had been restored by Roman discipline. Writers insisted that Rome had never truly been threatened. Statues were raised to honor the legions. Public speeches praised the victory at Watling Street as proof that the empire could not be shaken by the fury of tribes. But the people of Britannia remembered differently. They whispered the truth in the corners of markets and in the quiet spaces between the trees. They spoke of a queen who refused to kneel and who carried the voice of the island in her heart. They spoke of a woman who rose from violence with the strength of a storm and led the tribes in a fire that nearly swept Rome from the province. Her defeat did not silence the memory. It gave it shape. It carved her spirit into the land itself. As the years passed, stories of Boudicca began to flow through the countryside like secret rivers. Shepherds claimed they heard the rumble of wheels on quiet nights when the wind grew sharp. Travelers walking alone through the mists of early morning swore they saw the outline of a chariot cresting a distant hill. Children were told to listen when the air changed. Some said that when the forests stirred without warning, it was the sound of her horses cutting through the fog. Others believed that every gust that swept across the marshes carried the echo of her vow for justice. The Romans dismissed these tales as superstition, Yet even they avoided certain fields after nightfall. There were places where the silence felt too heavy and the shadows too familiar. Places where a faint trail in the grass looked as if a chariot had passed not centuries ago, but only hours before. Despite the walls Rome rebuilt and the patrols it stationed, the empire could never fully bury the presence that lingered in the land. Boudicca had become more than a queen. She had become a spirit of reckoning woven into the breath of Britannia. Generations later, her story continued to move through the island as both warning and promise. To some, she was a symbol of defiance. To others, a reminder that even the mightiest empire could be shaken when justice demanded a voice. Her name became a quiet thunder that lived in the hearts of those who felt forgotten or crushed by power. The fire she carried had not died in the ruins of Watling Street. It had spread into every corner of the province, unseen but enduring. If you walk through the fields at dusk, when the last light stretches thin across the hills, you might feel it. A faint tremor beneath your feet, a whisper of hooves moving over distant ground. A presence that does not fade with time. The island remembers. The land remembers. And the spirit of the Queen still rides. Stay with this history. There are more forgotten shadows waiting to rise. Like the tale. Follow the channel and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter that history tried to bury.